Today we are diving deep into a country you probably don't hear much about on the nightly news, but one with a truly fascinating, if turbulent, story. The Central African Republic, or CAR for short. Now, if you're anything like me, you want to know the whole narrative from the beginning. So get comfy because we're travelling through time and history in the heart of Africa. So before the colonial powers drew their lines on a map, this region was a complex, beautiful tapestry of diverse indigenous groups, each with their own unique way of life. They were the original foundations of this nation's rich culture. But around the early 1700s, everything began to shift. This area became a pivotal crossroads for the lucrative trade networks of the era, like the Atlantic, Trans-Saharan, and Indian Ocean trades, especially in enslaved people and ivory. And unfortunately, the desire to profit from this trade, often through slave raids, started to foster animosity between ethnic groups that still echo today. Fast forward to the late 19th century, and the infamous scramble for Africa is in full swing. And guess who comes knocking? France. They began annexing the area in the 1880s, and by 1894, they formalised their control, setting up a dependency called Ubangi-Chari. Now here's where the history gets really tough. In 1910, Ubangi-Chari became part of the huge Federation of French Equatorial Africa, and the French, trying to avoid paying for the territory's development, took a page from the dark book of the Belgian Congo and leased enormous tracts of land to private commercial concessionaires. These companies had virtually unlimited power to exploit the land and the people, demanding forced labour to collect vast amounts of rubber and ivory. So although France technically banned the domestic slave trade in the 1910s, the exploitation simply continued through this brutal system of forced labour. But the people weren't quiet, because throughout the 1920s and 30s, indigenous Africans staged violent protests against the abuses carried out by these companies. And this resistance preserved their traditions and values, even amidst the heavy pressures of colonial rule. That's why after World War II, the seeds of nationalism started to sprout, fueled by the desire for self-determination. And in 1946, the territory was finally granted its own assembly and representation in the French Parliament. This is where a massive figure steps onto the stage: Barthélemy Boganda. Boganda, the founder of the pro-independence social evolution movement of Black Africa, became the first Central African elected to the French Parliament. Honestly, you could say he was a true pioneer. His ultimate vision was a unified state combining the French territories of Chad, Gabon, Congo and Ubangi-Chari. And by 1958, the territory achieved self-government within the French community, with Boganda as its prime minister. But tragedy struck just 6 months before full independence. Boganda died in a mysterious plane crash in 1959, which naturally left a critical power vacuum. Then, the moment arrived. On August 13, 1960, the Central African Republic was born, marking the end of colonial rule. And David Dacko, a figure who claimed a family connection to Boganda, became the first president. But the celebration was short-lived. Dacko quickly drained the national budget to reward his supporters, and by 1962, he made his party the only legal one, thereby turning the country into a one-party state. Enter the first coup. Amidst mounting debt and a threatened nationwide strike, Army Commander John Bedell Bokassa overthrew Dacko in a coup at the end of 1965, which means the CAR welcomed a new leader, and Bokassa's rule became one of the country's most infamous and bizarre chapters. Because in an effort to prolong his mandate, he abolished the constitution, dissolved the legislature, and declared himself president for life in 1972. But it doesn't stop there. Bokassa proclaimed himself emperor in 1976, renaming the country the Central African Empire. And his coronation in 1977 was an extravagant affair that nearly bankrupted the already poor nation, all while his regime was characterised by brutal human rights abuses and widespread corruption. His rule imploded in 1979 after widespread student protests were violently suppressed, resulting in the massacre of many schoolchildren while in detention. With his international allies appalled, France stepped in and deposed him in a military coup, restoring David Dacko to the presidency. And the country was renamed the Central African Republic once more. Now you'd think it was a happily ever after at that point. But the post-Bokassa era brought more turbulence, because after Dako was ousted again in a bloodless coup in 1981, the country went through 12 years of military rule. Sure, a moment of democratic hope returned in 1993, when Ange Félix Patasse won presidential elections, but stability remained elusive, and the turmoil just continued well into the 21st century. In 2003, rebel leader and former army commander François Bozizé seized power in yet another coup. And then, fast forward to 2012, and a new mainly Muslim rebel coalition called Séléka rapidly started to overrun the country. By 2013, the Séléka rebels had successfully seized the capital, forcing Bozizé to flee in what was the country's fifth major coup. But the Séléka's widespread abuses immediately spurred the formation of mainly Christian self-defense militias known as the anti-Balaka. So, this basically ushered in a devastating new phase of conflict, one marked by terrifying cycles of ethno-religious violence, massive displacement, and a heartbreaking humanitarian crisis. And remember, the conflict is less about religious ideology and much more about identity and who gets to control the country's abundant natural resources. In response, the international community had to step in. The UN authorised a massive peacekeeping force, MINUSCA, in 2014, and France had to step up its troop deployment to disarm the militias. So, despite elections, including the re-election of President Faustin-Archange Touadéra in 2020, much of the CAR remains under the control of armed groups. And just recently, in 2023, a new constitution was approved that effectively ended presidential term limits, which creates the potential for Touadéra to extend his rule as the country's long, arduous quest for lasting stability continues to this day. Okay, so we've finished the intense history. Now let's zoom in on the actual country, the Central African Republic. Think of the CAR as the geographical bullseye of Africa. Its name tells you the main thing you need to know: it's totally landlocked. It doesn't have a coastline, which is a massive challenge for trade. So if you look at a map, CAR is sandwiched between a bunch of countries. To the north is Chad, down south are the Republic of the Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. To the east, it borders Sudan and South Sudan, and to the west, it borders Cameroon. Now, how big is this place? Well, it covers about 623,000 square kilometres, which is roughly 240,500 square miles. The land itself is surprisingly diverse. Mostly it's a huge, flat or gently rolling plateau, and this plateau creates two distinct worlds inside the CAR. First, there's the south. This is the wet side. It has a humid, equatorial climate. Think dense, dripping rainforests. And fun fact, a significant part of the famous Congo Basin is right here. This region gets tons of rainfall and is where the country's biggest rivers flow, like the Ubangi and the Sangha. Plus, the capital, Bangui, sits right on the Ubangi River, which is where most people live. Then you have the north. This is the dry side. The climate shifts to a Sahelo-Sudanian type. This means it's mostly open savanna, classic African grassland. It's beautiful but much less populated. This is also where you find the highest points, like the Kare Mountains in the northwest. Its highest peak, Mont Ngawi, stands at about 1,410 metres, or 4,625 feet. And as you can imagine, the wildlife here is unbelievable. The mix of savanna and rainforest means you get all kinds of animals. In the northern grasslands, you find antelope, buffalo, and the huge savanna elephants. Then in the southern forests, you find the truly rare species like lowland gorillas, chimpanzees, and the beautiful shy bongo antelope. And don't worry, the government has set aside big areas to protect these animals. In fact, places like the Dzanga Sankar Reserve are absolutely critical sanctuaries for these endangered species. Alright, now we've hit the modern era, and things are complicated. So here's the deal with the politics. The current president, Faustin-Archange Touadéra, has essentially secured his political future, for now. He recently pushed through constitutional changes that let him run for a third term, basically allowing him to stay in power indefinitely. This is obviously controversial and raises major questions about the country's path to democracy. But the reality on the ground is that the government's power is very limited. Insecurity and instability undermine the entire country. So, while the government does control key cities, including the capital, vast parts of the country are still run by various rebel groups. The government only maintains control because of strong international support, mainly from Rwandan forces and, notably, Russian mercenaries. And this precarious political and security situation has a massive negative impact on the economy. Just look at the numbers. The country's entire economic output, or GDP, is pegged at about $2.75 billion in 2024. But this figure is actually 20% lower in real terms than it was in 2012. Think about that. Over a decade of conflict has wiped out 1/5 of the national economic capacity. And if you look at what people actually earn, the average income is shocking. The average person's income stood at only $973 in 2023, making it one of the lowest in the entire world. But despite these massive challenges, there have been tiny signs of life, mainly driven by natural resources like forestry, gold, and diamond mining. And speaking of resources, let's talk about diamonds. Diamond production, which is a major export, declined recently. Why? It's because of a decline in international demand thanks to the global surge in synthetic diamonds. And that's not the only thing that's going down. It's also the well-being of the people. And here's what I mean. Poverty persists at tragically high levels. The World Bank estimates 67.7% of the population is living in extreme poverty. To put that simply, that means surviving on less than $2.15 per person per day. Sadly, that extreme poverty rate is actually projected to rise even higher over the next couple of years. But the good news is that the CAR is not entirely alone. Several international partners, like the IMF, World Bank, and the African Development Bank, are actively involved, working to fund programs and push for reform. The country is absolutely rich in natural wealth, but it desperately needs better revenue collection, especially from the fuel and mining sectors, to convert that wealth into prosperity for its citizens. Now that we understand the land and the politics, let's talk about the people who give the Central African Republic its true character. Because this is an absolutely fascinating place, built on incredible diversity and deep community values. The CAR is home to over 80 different ethnic groups. That's a huge number for one nation, and each group brings its own customs, languages, and traditions to the table. Some of the major groups you'll hear about are the Banda, the Baya, the Manjia, the Sara, and the Fulani. But despite all that diversity, the people have actually forged a strong sense of unity, mostly through those shared experiences and shared struggles, which gives them a common national identity. And that tolerance extends to faith. Religious life here is equally diverse and generally characterised by religious tolerance. The population's faith reflects centuries of different influences across the continent, with the majority following some form of Christianity or traditional beliefs. On one side you've got the Roman Catholic, and on the other is Protestant. Then you've got those who still follow traditional, indigenous religions, and the rest are Muslim. So visitors are totally expected to be respectful of all these practices, whether they're attending a church service, a mosque, or a traditional ceremony. Which brings us here, because if there's one thing about Central African people, it's that they just love to celebrate. That's why throughout the year, communities come together for festivals that showcase their rich heritage, including traditional ceremonies like coming-of-age ceremonies and harvest festivals that are super important to community life. Two of the biggest public events are the annual Bua Festival, which showcases traditional music, dance, and crafts from various ethnic groups, and the Festival of Bangui, where the capital hosts major performances by musicians and artists, all reinforcing their national identity. And if you ever find yourself in Bangui, definitely check out the Boganda Museum, which exhibits traditional musical instruments, tools, and village architecture, offering a perfect glimpse into the country's deep past. Now, I mentioned it a little bit before, but CAR's cultural heritage really shines through in its music, which is a vibrant blend of old and new influences. You'll hear contemporary favourites like soukous, Afrobeat, pop music, and Western rock, but many artists put their own electrified spin on Congolese music, blending African rhythms with styles like the rumba and cha-cha. A popular local genre is Zokela, which mixes village traditions with urban sounds. Plus, you absolutely can't talk about Central African music without mentioning the indigenous groups, particularly the Aka Pygmy people in the southwestern forests. whose music has gained international attention. While the problems of the slave trade and colonialism severely damaged the artisan culture, it hasn't completely disappeared. So, today you can find beautiful woven mats and baskets, simple carved stools, and unique pottery. More recently, artisans have even started creating detailed pictures using butterfly wings glued to paper and fine carvings from ebony and tropical hardwoods, which, thankfully, you can find at Bangai's Artisans Market. In terms of storytelling, the country holds a wealth of traditional, oral legends and folk stories, passed down through generations of storytellers using lively songs and chants. And the country's best-known writer, his name is Makombo Bambote, and he wrote a book called Darba's Travels, From Awada to Bangi. If you haven't read it yet, maybe now's the time to add it to your list. Now, after everything we talked about, what's one amazing, unique cultural thing do you think makes the Central African people stand out? Let me know in the comments section down below. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you're going to love this next one.